Can you hear me all right? All right. This is really cool. Of course, it's a very cool venue, but it's bigger than I'm used to for these, product tank kind of talks. And actually, this was designed to be kind of cozy and interactive. And I don't know how that's going to play so much, but because I really do want you, if I say something that doesn't make sense, I want you to just be able to ask. You can I'll tell you what, try yelling it out, and I will repeat it for everybody. We don't want to pass a mic around a room this big, but anyway, I'll try to save plenty of room for Q&A at the end. But anyway, thank you for coming to this. I will warn you, this is kind of an advanced talk, not like rocket science advanced, just that the truth is there's a huge range in how people do product. You probably all know that. Huge range. It's usually a function of the kind of company. I usually label them as IT-style companies and product-style companies. And anyway, if you've already started working in the modern way, we'll just call it that for now, modern product way, then there's just a common set of problems people run into once they've actually started doing real product work. And I deal with those all the time because what my job really is I'm an advisor to a bunch of companies, and they're all the ones I work with, and of course there's some natural selection going on. I'm working with the ones that I think are really great teams that are trying to solve really important problems. And so I see these issues a lot, and I started sharing the issues. I don't think that I have the perfect answer for all of these. I just want to share the issue and what at least I suggest with these. So they're a little more advanced topics. If you're really new to product, some of this might not make a lot of sense. So, in which case I wrote a book. You can get the book. So this is... Sorry? There's a free bar. A free bar. Okay. So for those that don't know, maybe what's most important is I did start as an engineer, so that's where my sort of biases come from. My first 10 years was writing software. That was my origin story, a typical engineer frustrated with their product manager and figure I could do it at least as well. And so I asked to learn product, and I did. So, and then I worked at Netscape, which was really a really lucky place to work. That was when the internet was born, and it was really the epicenter of the internet. I worked for Mark Andreessen. Ben Horowitz also worked for Mark Andreessen. If you know him, he's one of the best thinkers of product in the world. And anyway, it was a fabulous place to work on product, especially because as an industry, we were figuring out what it really meant to do product in the age of the internet, which really did change a lot. And then I worked at eBay. We were eventually sold. If you remember, we lost the browser wars. And so we were eventually sold to AOL. But I had got to know the co-founder of eBay, Pierre Omidyar, and I just thought this guy was great, and I loved what he wanted to do with this marketplace at the time. In my experience, eBay was really the first app on the internet to get traction. Who knows what the very first one was? Anybody's guess. But eBay is probably the first real business which was a child of the internet. You couldn't do eBay before the internet. So it was a really great place to learn and build a product and design organization. But after that, I was exhausted, and I wanted to start SVPG. And just with a few friends, we had worked either at Netscape or at eBay together, and wanted to work with startups. And so that is what I do. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. So let's just jump in. These problems are not actually in any particular order. They're just kind of top of mind. I will say the first one I'll talk about kind of gets us hopefully on the same page in terms of where I wanted to focus the issues. In general, there's a lot of frustration out there with Agile and with lean startup techniques. That's no secret. This happens, by the way, with everything that comes in our industry. There's always a wave of excitement, and then people realize that, what happens is it's oversold. This is going on right now with two things. Design thinking, right? Which is actually a great technique, but a lot of people are, criticizing it because it's not for everything. And same thing is happening with OKRs. Another really good technique that most people are very confused about. So it's just normal that there's these frustrations. I am a strong, actually an advocate for all four of the things I just referenced: Agile, lean startup techniques, and design thinking, and OKRs, but in the right context. So much of that is, I need to provide that context. So I want to kind of get to the source of the frustration here. So these principles, hopefully, look familiar to you, because these are really the fundamental principles behind Agile, which is really just two, right? If you boil down all the hype, I'll get it out of there. We do frequent releases, no less than every 2 weeks. And to be honest, that's where most teams get the real benefit, just to take their 2-month cycle, or sometimes 3 6-month cycle, and get it down to 2 weeks. Usually requires release and test automation to do that, but they get real benefits to that. But that's pretty much it most companies get with Agile, because they don't really understand the real benefit comes from the second one: empowered and accountable teams. They don't do that in most companies. And that's honestly the biggest single difference between IT-style companies and product-style companies, is whether the people are actually empowered to solve hard problems. I want to also, this is a little bit of a side point, but I will tell you that the role of product management is completely different if you're in a company that's IT-style versus product-style. And even to be a little brutal here, if you're in an IT-style company that doesn't have empowered teams, you really don't need product managers. Sad truth, because all those decisions are really being made by the executives, mostly stakeholders. And the product managers are really product owners, just product owners, the administrative role, and some project management thrown in. So, and that's a depressing thing, but that's why I try to show teams you really want to be in this empowered team model. But that's why so many companies don't see the power of Agile really beyond iterations. They're not doing that. The second two principles, of course, are the premise of lean startup, is that we need to learn fast in order to innovate. The truth is, innovation is very much a function of the number of experiments we can run. So that's critical. And, the basic idea, minimize waste. And the biggest form of waste is having designers design and engineers build and QA test and finally release something after 3 months, 6 months, only to find it doesn't work. Doesn't solve the customer's problem or our business problem. And that's the fundamental thing we were trying to avoid. So I would argue those are 4 good principles. Here's the problem, though. Some of you may recognize this. My favorite Agile coach out there is Henrik Nieberg. Many of you probably heard of him, at least. He kind of got famous because his most famous client was Spotify, and Spotify is a really good product company that does a lot of things quite well. But anyway, one of the things he's trying to explain lean and Agile. And he tries to explain that what you don't want to do is the old, up on the top way is sort of the old way. We want to build some big system. We'll just do this part of the infrastructure, and then we'll do this component and this component. And a year later, we finally have it, and we find out it doesn't work, right? That's the basic, what you don't want to do and what you're trying to avoid when you use Agile and Lean. And so he's trying to say, instead, break that into reasonable steps. Break this into steps. So, and of course, he picked the car metaphor, which I'm betting he regrets at this point, because a lot of people get really sidetracked by that. So try to ignore the particular metaphor, but because obviously if you think you're going to build a car, you wouldn't start with a skateboard, but just kind of go with it for a minute. And his point is, okay, well, we can get real learning out of each of these steps. And this is all true. The thing is, and by the way, I send people his articles all the time if they're an IT-style organization. So the first thing I say is, I'm not going to work with you, but I would, there are things you can do. There's things you can do to get better. And this is as good as I know for an IT-style organization. And here's what's going on, though, really underneath, is that we have two very different sets of challenges. The first one is we need to come up with a solution that, I describe it with this taxonomy of valuable, usable, feasible, viable. Valuable means the customer will buy it or choose to use it. That's really obviously the most important one. The second is usable, means they can figure out how to use it. Feasible means we can actually build it with the technology stack we have, with the time we have, with the engineer skills we have. And viable means it can actually work for our stakeholders, work for the different parts of a business. We can afford it. It's legal. It supports the privacy issues. That's what we're trying to do that, but we're also trying to deliver a solution to our customers that they can run a business on, or we can build a business on, which normally means it's reliable, it's scalable, it's performant, it's maintainable. If you've all heard all the angst out there about MVPs and how, in fact, in many companies, they ban the term MVP. The reason for that is because they are mixing these two needs. They're using the same tool for this. See, if I go back here, what does this even mean, really, when they're two? Is this, we're using one tool to do two completely different jobs. And you might notice the tool we're using are the engineers. Now, of course, we know we have to be better in a product organization. So we realize these are two very different problems to solve, very different tasks. The first one we refer to as discovery, and the second one we refer to as delivery. So this is not a process, I want to be clear. This is just a conceptual model. I can tell you the process that people use for this. Different companies do it different ways, but the idea is these two activities are going on. The first activity, discovery, is there for us to come up with the right solution, figure out what to build. Valuable, usable, feasible, viable. As we figure that out, the engineers are able to deliver that solution, reliable, scalable, performant, and maintainable. Two very different, and we're using different people to do each of those. The product manager and designer, with help from engineers, are doing discovery, but the engineers and QA are doing delivery. Now, this goes by lots of names. Some people call this dual track agile. Early Google called it fake it before you make it. One of my favorites is Airbnb calls this, and this will sound a little weird to you maybe, but they call it build things that don't scale and then build things that do scale. They're trying to emphasize that point that you're not trying to build something that scales. Goes by lots of names. I just refer to it as discovery and delivery, or really with most of the teams I work with, they're actually using a variant of this called continuous discovery and continuous delivery. But that's the heart of modern product right there. You can call it whatever you want. I could keep going. Different companies use different names for it. But that's what's going on. We realize there are those two problems. If you're a product manager, your responsibility is to make sure, just those lines in between are the product backlog, to make sure the things we put on the product backlog are things that are worth building. We're not doing like the IT style where we're just having our engineers build something, most of which will actually be thrown away. So hopefully that makes sense. That's kind of the foundation for what we'll be talking about. All right. Yeah, And because of all the confusion around the term MVP, which is because it's obviously, you know this, it stands for minimum viable product. The problem with that, and it does sound pithy, but the problem with that is the P is never a product. It should always be a prototype. That's where so many people get confused. So I just use the term prototypes. In discovery, we do prototypes. In delivery, we produce products. Product is something you can sell and stand behind with your customers. Prototypes are for us to learn. And this is maybe beyond the scope of what we can talk about here, but just I want to be very clear. There are many kinds of prototypes. There are 4 major ones that I believe every modern product team needs to be competent on all 4 of those kinds of prototypes because they solve different risks. And some are meant to be used quantitatively and some are meant to be used qualitatively. So that's a whole discussion about discovery techniques. But that's what's going on in discovery. We're figuring out what to build, and then in delivery, we're actually delivering that. Okay. All right, so now with that foundation, let's talk about some of the very common sort of second-order issues that come up with organizations once they've started working this way. The first one, and this just seems to be a pattern in a lot of companies. The organization, it's actually not that hard to learn the techniques and get good at the techniques to quickly see if an idea works or not. Of course, there's lots of different kinds of ideas, and they each have their own profile, and that's why we have a bunch of techniques. But still, you can learn quickly what those techniques are. But what happens is in a lot of organizations, the dynamics are most of the ideas are coming from executives in the company. They're coming often from the CEO. I don't know if any of you saw, but just today, the Kissmetrics product, you guys know that? The founder of that wrote a huge mea culpa about how his billion-dollar mistake, how he destroyed Kissmetrics. And he described his behavior, which he now knows was not so healthy. But every day he was bringing different ideas to the product team. And, eventually they took something good and ruined it, by his own admission. So that's very common. But what happens is the teams realize that, okay, our job, our obligation in product is to make sure this is something worth building. So they quickly do a prototype, they'll validate that, and honestly, this is not a function of your executives, this is everywhere, even in the very best companies in the world. Most of those ideas don't actually work out. When I say they don't work out, customers aren't willing to buy it, or they don't actually want to use it, or it's too complicated for people, they need training classes or videos to figure it out. Or it's just going to take way longer than they thought to build. So for whatever reason, it's not going to work out. So what do? They go back to that VP of International or whoever, whatever stakeholder said, I want this. They go back and they say, we're not going to build it because it doesn't work. Sorry. And the thing is, pretty soon, the stakeholders start complaining that all they get is, no, we're not going to do this. No, we're not going to do this. And that gets old. And then they start saying, well, what are you going to do? And they get frustrated. And a lot of times they'll actually start going around the organization, or they'll escalate up to the CEO and say, this is not working. And I have to explain to these product teams that your job is not to be the gatekeeper and validate ideas and say yes or no. Your job is actually harder than that. Your job is, yes, you should make sure that idea works, but if it doesn't, you need to come up with a solution that does. That's our job in product, is to actually come up with a solution that does. That usually requires several iterations, sometimes many iterations, depending on how hard the problem is. So our job is to discover solutions. Once you get to that point, which I could teach you to validate an idea in a couple days. It's a lot harder to get you to come up, good enough to come up with winning solutions. But that's really what we're paid to do. And once you do that, your stakeholders, your executives in your company start viewing you as the problem solvers, not the gatekeepers. So that's sort of the first anti-pattern. My guess is many of you have seen this because it's kind of a classic problem now in organizations. They've learned how to validate, they've learned how to run experiments, we have better tools than ever, and they just say no a lot. So that's not really what we're trying to do. Okay. Another one. I just sort of think this is human nature at play, but there are good techniques for planning your discovery work. They're simple techniques. They're supposed to be simple, but there's something in product people, I think, that makes them stress over prioritization. In fact, I think that word is really not a helpful word or concept for product teams, the whole concept of prioritization. Because it's based on this, I think, myth that you can even predict the inputs that you're using to prioritize. Because when you talk about prioritize, what we're really thinking in our heads is how much value is this going to create, or how much money are we going to make, and also how hard is it going to be to build. You don't know either of those things. What we would much rather do than spend a bunch of time prioritizing all of these product ideas and features is get very good at testing ideas quickly and coming up with winning solutions fast. Because that's actually what we're paid to do. And so what I try to get teams to do, a little planning is fine, and I'm not exaggerating, 10 minutes up front. But quickly you need to get your hands dirty. For product people, that means prototypes. Normally, your product designer is creating most of the prototypes. Not all. There's some that are created by your engineers, but most are created by the designers. Most of the kinds of prototypes and most of the instances of prototypes are created by designers. That's sort of another thing I'm assuming here. In IT-style organizations, they rarely have real product designers. They usually just have some visual design person, maybe. But in a product organization, they have serious product designers that are skilled in user research, interaction design, and visual design. So these are true partners for product. So I'm assuming you have that. That is your key partner. Those two, the product manager and the product designer, should sit right next to each other. I mean, it's really bad if you don't, let me just say that. They should sit right next to each other because you're solving these problems together. And that's what we're doing, we're prototyping. And we're validating those prototypes. That's when we actually learn. You can go and do all the analysis you want. I promise you it's going to prove to be mostly a waste of time. So, a little bit of planning, okay, not much. Yeah, I'm going to come back to an element of this little bit. All right. I mentioned there's 4 kind of risks in product: value risk, usability risk, feasibility risk, and viability risk. Again, I think it's human nature, but most people gravitate towards the risks that they feel like they can do the most about. For most product teams, that's usability, and that's feasibility. The designers I know how to deal with usability, and the engineers, I know how to deal with feasibility. And value and viability, they're like, oh, those are hard. Those are hard. We'll kind of let the CEO, that's the thing too. If some executive tells you they want some feature, they are implicitly taking responsibility for value and viability. And that's not a safe thing. They can't it's not their fault, it's just that we don't know. Even if the concept is valuable, our solution may not be. So they're not thinking broadly enough about risks. It doesn't, again, take long. This is part of that planning. Most things we work on, a lot of the things we work on are not, we just say no-brainers. They're not really that complicated. They're not that risky. They're things we've done many times. Triaging a bug or something like that is totally minor. But a simple optimization test, for example, it's low risk. But then other things we're working on can be very risky, and that's where we want to spend our time. So that's when you have to really be good at this. And product teams get better at this. I try to set expectations for product teams that most of your time should be on value risk. That's where most of the work almost always comes out. There's of course, most companies are also exploring some new technology like machine learning right now, and that is a very non-trivial feasibility risk. And so that's an exception to that. Those efforts dominate with feasibility risk, but most of the time your engineers are like, I built stuff like this 100 times. I'm not worried that we can build this. It's more the value side. And the other side, I want to point out, viability. That is squarely on the product manager. I often advocate the concept of the product manager should be the CEO of their product. And I'm not saying that to imply that they're the boss of anybody, because unlike the CEO, the product manager is not the boss of anybody. But I'm saying it because of this point about viability. Nobody else on the product team, none of your designers or engineers are expected to know how the product is marketed, how it's sold, what are the legal constraints, what are the privacy issues, what's the revenue side, what's the cost side. They're expecting the product manager knows that. And by the way, if the product manager doesn't know that, then you really have two choices. You escalate everything up to an executive, any decision up to an executive, which nobody wants to do that. Or even worse, you call a meeting with all the stakeholders and you let them fight it out. All you get is a watered down product that way, designed by committee. So this is on the product manager. That's what's meant by CEO of a product manager, CEO of a product. It means they, like the CEO, they know the different dimensions of the business. It's a lot harder to actually be the CEO, don't get me wrong, but that's the role the product manager's playing. You have to know what those constraints are. If there are legal issues, you need to understand them so that you can provide that context to the team. All right. I noticed this building, what did it say? Ethical Society. I think that was on the front, right? So I'm curious about maybe the origin on that, but we need more of that, for sure. And I am trying to get product teams to think more about ethical risks. There's no secret our industry is really disappointed on that front. We've created a lot of things before we, as an industry, knew the kind of bad actors and what they'd be able to do. And so in addition to will they buy it, can they use it, can we build it, and can our stakeholders support it, I've been advocating, should we build it? And it's not, and again, it's not like, no, we should, it's more like, no, we shouldn't do this, but we should do it a different way. And so we have to make sure, especially with these ethical issues, I should point out, it's usually, there's no question it's the CEO that's ultimately responsible for these ethical lapses. However, it's usually the case that it was a product manager that saw the issue first. And so I'm trying to encourage product managers to take more responsibility of this. When you spot these, you should raise this issue, but you should also think about alternatives, better ways of solving the problem that don't have the negative effects on society or your company. So, anyway. This is another really common anti-pattern that I think, again, its origin is really humans. Product teams are often scared. They're scared to take risks. They're scared to do something bold. Usually that's because, especially if you were there from the beginning, this is why founders are so much better at this. They're so much braver because they have been there from the beginning. They know everything that's been tried. In particular, they know, okay, with whatever your product is, they know what things in there are actually important to be there and what things are just random. They're just incidental, accidental. They're not important. If you were to change them, it wouldn't hurt anything. But other things, if you were to change them, it'd be awful. They know that. Typical product team doesn't know that, especially because, they joined 5 years after, the founder created that whole thing. So they don't have that context. So they're scared, and it makes them risk averse. And I like to frame that as you're just playing defense. I find so many teams that are just, they're so scared to do something bold that they're just doing these minor little, they're called optimization tests. I think I'm going to talk about optimization next. Yeah, I am. So we'll go into that. But they're just doing minor, low-risk things, and they're not actually moving the needle. Another way this is often phrased is they're just doing value capture activities, and they're not doing value creation activities. And you're not paid to do that. Or let me just say, you're way overpaid just to be doing defensive stuff. They're counting on you to really create more value for our customers and for our company. And that's offense. So, what I'm really saying is that you need to be bold, but you need to be smart about how you take risks. Especially, the truth is, if you're a startup, this is one of the things I love about startups. Startups have, they're hard for sure, no question, but they also have nothing to lose, right? They have no revenue, they have no reputation, they have no customers. They're just trying to come up with something that they can sell. So there's very little downside. So you can imagine, and Uber took advantage of this, Airbnb took advantage of this. They just went wild early on, and it wasn't until later that they started worrying about things like laws, right? They got away with it for a while. But, it's if you followed in London and New York, there's challenges for sure now. But that's, if we're an established company, and most of us are in either a growth stage or an enterprise scale company. If you're an established company, you still need to take these risks, but you have more responsibility to do them in a smart way. We say you have to protect revenue, protect reputation, protect our customers, and protect our colleagues. And we have really good ways of doing that. And that's what you need to be. You need to be trained in those techniques to do that. So you got to take risks, and you got to take big risks, but you got to do it in a smart way that doesn't put the company at risk. That's probably the single biggest anti-pattern I see. Okay. So that relates to this. I'm going to give a plug, actually, to Optimizely here in a second. Full disclosure, they were a client too, and I actually lobbied them hard for what we're going to talk about, and I'm happy that they did it. But the idea here is optimization is awesome. Don't get me wrong. Does everybody know optimization that's what most people think of when they hear Optimizely or Test and Target. They think of, and in fact, if you say A/B testing, most people, that's what they think of, or multivariate testing. They think it's just, these low-risk tests. Like, for example, we all have our funnel, and we're just playing with this call to action. Maybe people aren't seeing the call to action. Maybe they don't recognize that's a button or whatever. And so we'll do these simple little tests, totally low risk. And by the way, you should do this. If you can get your conversion rate from 4% to 4.5%, that's good work and valuable. But that's not going to get you from 4 to 8. You're not going to be anywhere near as effective as Amazon doing that. And that's the difference between discovery and optimization. In optimization, that we're doing these small, low-risk tests. They're usually also known as split tests. In other words, they're so low risk that we're perfectly fine sending 50% of the traffic to the new one and 50% to the old one, because that lets us most quickly get an answer on whether this is better or worse, or honestly, in most cases, no difference. But still, that's learning. And so that's fine for an optimization test. It's not fine for discovery. So we do A/B tests in discovery as well, but there we're talking more radical changes. And so we're not going to send 50% of the traffic. We usually send 1% or less of the traffic. Now, it used to be that almost every company I worked with had to have 2 A/B testing infrastructures to do this. They used either Optimizely or one of the same ilk out there, they did that for optimization. And just to translate for you, what that really meant is if they could do it all in the client, they did it with Optimizely. If it required going server-side, go deeper into their technology stack, they had to use their own homegrown A/B testing infrastructure. And almost every company I know built their own homegrown A/B testing infrastructure in order to do discovery A/B testing. Now, and my argument to Optimizely was you need to provide APIs so that people can use your tools for more than just these surface-level marketing-style tests. And they did, and so that's good. And I'm hoping, of course, the whole industry gets serious about that because it significantly reduces the cost for us to run these tests. Yeah, but that's the difference. You don't want to confuse optimization with discovery. And it's not either or. Every good team I know is doing both. Now, obviously, or maybe not obviously, you can't really do optimization until you're live in production. So if you're just getting started, it's all discovery. But once you've got something live, we turn on optimization testing, and that runs in the background, honestly, forever. It doesn't stop. They're just a background activity. We can always think of things that are worth trying. It's low risk. It's easy to do. It's computers doing the work. It doesn't require us. By definition, it doesn't really require design work, almost no engineering work. It's easy stuff. And we run that in the background, and we focus most of our time on the discovery work. So it's both. All right. This is probably the second biggest anti-pattern I see right now. And this one, I don't really attribute to human nature as much as company culture. There are different company cultures out there that pride themselves on one or the other. The poster children for this, Google is the poster child for data. You've all heard data beats opinions. It's kind of at their core mantra. And the poster child for qualitative is Apple. It's like, who cares what the data says? We know what's best. And those are both myths, I will tell you. They're both exaggerations because both companies do both. The irony is that in the case of Google, they've actually been doing the qualitative even longer than they've been doing the quantitative because for their early time, they didn't have that much traffic. And of course, now they take advantage of unprecedented traffic, and so they should. But they've also very good at the qualitative. Now, why is this important? Because honestly, it's sort of religious in companies sometimes how they view it. It's like, we're a data culture, or we're a qualitative culture. And I'm like, it's not rational. And the reason is because neither one answers both types of questions. We need qualitative and quantitative. So we can look at Optimizely and see that our cool A/B test that we were so excited about, it confirms us through a very nice dashboard that it doesn't work. That's what it says. It doesn't work. There's nowhere on that dashboard that can tell us why it doesn't work. So we have to get out of the office and go talk to users and customers to figure out why it doesn't work, the why. That's qualitative. And then once we learn, we usually get some big insights, which are really just theories. And then if we want to prove if we're right, then we'll run another test. So that's the point. The quantitative tells us what's actually happening, but can't tell us why. The qualitative can give us good hints as to why. And so I try to get every good product team to do both. The hardest company to really use as an example is actually Apple because they are so secretive. They really don't share. And there was just recently, to my knowledge, the very first exception where their tech lead, senior engineer on probably their most amazing product. I mean, if you think about it, you know, they're on the edge always of $1 trillion company. It's all on this, right? It's all on the phone. And you guys know this, I think this is 12 years old now, right? 12? I think it's 12. And it was a 3.5-year effort for the first iPhone. But if you're old enough to remember, when this first came out, this was actually the first 100% touchscreen device. first out there. And interestingly, the company who had tried and failed to do, well, not really a touchscreen, but to do a non-keyboard device was actually Apple with remember the Newton? Some of you heard of it, Newton? And Apple it failed miserably. And in their own postmortem, they realized the reason that failed was because it was too hard to enter text. And so going in to the iPhone, I mean, it was a vision. Steve Jobs' vision was this touchscreen-based device. And they had really good technical data on that the new generation of touchscreens could, in fact, might be able to support a phone, a full device. But they knew right from the outset, the biggest risk, when we talk about analyzing risk, the biggest risk was to be able to enter text. Everything else, not so bad. Enter text, hugely hard problem. Nobody had solved that. And so they actually, the guy who was the tech lead on the keyboard for the first phone published a book recently on how product discovery was done at Apple and primarily focused on the iPhone. He also talks about some other products there. And it's kind of his journey as an engineer to learn all these prototyping techniques. And there's no question they're big on qualitative. Designers played a huge role. Their product people are essentially their executives. They play a huge role. But he also shares several examples where the data, they used live data tests in order to figure out, for example, things like just how wide an icon should be. That's a quantitative test. So it's worth reading, by the way. The book is called Creative Selection, which is his sort of own personal take on how to describe discovery there as it's natural selection, but with design playing a big role kind of thing. But it's a really useful book to get insights into their process. All right, so the bottom line is, though, this common problem, we want teams to make sure they're capable on both quantitative and qualitative. All right. This is another one. Again, human nature. If the feature idea does not come from your CEO, it probably comes from you. It's normal. Let's say you finally get the executives in the company to back off and stop giving you prioritized roadmaps to go build, and they tell you instead, here's a problem to solve. That's what we want, by the way. That's what it means to be an empowered product team. But all it really did was move who comes up with the ideas from some executive to us. So we have ideas too, that's normal. The thing is, a lot of product teams will spend so much time just beating on that idea over and over and trying to get it to work. And I try to point out, look, that's just one approach to solving the problem. The problem usually has many different ways you can tackle it. And spending a few minutes, I'm not trying to encourage you to do a lot, I mean literally a few minutes. You can do this inside a half an hour. When you start work on a problem, like you're given an OKR, like classic OKR would be something like churn rate is too high. We need to significantly reduce our churn rates. Everybody know what churn rate is? How many customers don't resubscribe with us every year? So maybe that's too high, and you need to bring it down. Key result, maybe bring it down from 9% to 8%. Something like that in a quarter. All right, that's fine. There's tons of product ideas that every team has that could improve, our retention of customers. So what they do is they talk about it and they prioritize and they decide this is what we're going to do, and then they beat on that for weeks, sometimes months. And I'm like, don't do that. Step back a little bit, think about the different ways you could go about solving this problem, and then do some quick tests to see which ones really bear fruit, and then dive. There is a technique. There's a good discovery coach out there. Her name is Teresa Torres. Does anybody know that name? Yeah. So Teresa advocates a discovery technique called an opportunity tree, which is exactly for this. If you're having trouble thinking beyond the immediate feature that comes to mind, that's what an opportunity tree is for. There's another technique called an opportunity assessment, which is just a 5-minute version of stepping back and say, what problem are we really trying to solve here, just to make sure we're not drilling straight into a feature. That's another just common behavior. It's one of those things, if you have a product team that's doing that, I try to encourage, don't be too tough on them, just coach them a little, saying, hey, that's a long time to work on one approach. Maybe next time here or now we could back up a little bit and try a few different approaches. Okay. All right. This really is, if I had to pick one reason that companies that move to the real empowered product team model don't succeed, it's usually this. The product manager. It's not usually the designer and it's not usually the engineers. It's usually the product manager. And it's usually that the product manager has not done their homework. They haven't really been trained. They haven't been coached. And to be very clear, when that's the case, it's not the product manager's fault. It's the manager of the product manager's fault, right? We call them directors of product management, VP of product, whatever the title level might be here. And that's who's to blame there. And honestly, that's who we hold accountable. Some of you know the name Ben Horowitz. He wrote one of my favorite books in our space called The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which was written for startup CEOs and product managers. He's definitely of this school of thought. He was a big influence on me at Netscape on product and modern product. And anyway, he likes to say, look, the single most critical non-C-level position in a company is the director of product management. And his argument is, look, it's all about product teams. Anything meaningful. Your company's all about product, right? If you don't have product, you don't have anything to sell. You don't have anything to run a business on. So it's all about product. Product comes from product teams. But his argument is product teams are only as good as their product managers. And the person we hold accountable to making sure we have capable product managers is the director of product management. I tell people this all the time. I mentioned it last night. The heads of product are judged by their weakest product manager, and they're judged by the CEO. So the point here is that if you're a manager of product manager, this needs to be your number one responsibility, is to coach your product managers to competence. Now, I want to be specific what I mean by that. There's really 4 big responsibilities that's included and implied by this idea of product manager competence. And the first one is that you are deeply knowledgeable as product manager on your users and customers. Sounds obvious, but I mean really one of the people in the company that knows your customers as well as anybody. And the litmus test for that is easy. If the CEO is wondering, who should I ask in our company about our customers, they would immediately think of at least you as product manager. And you're doing that by visiting lots of customers. When I was given my first product, there was a guy coaching me, it was HP at the time, and he wouldn't let me make a single decision until after I had visited 30 customers. And even more, he insisted that half of them be outside of the US. Remember, HP is a global company, especially back then, but he's like, global's huge for us. And his point was, you don't know anything until you've done at least 30 customers. Now, I'm not sure that magic number's 30. I know it's not a handful. It's more than that. And you're always learning, but the truth is you need to get out there. And it worked. When I came back, first of all, I realized I knew nothing when I started. Just nothing about our customers, really. You just assume they're more like you than they are. It's classic behavior. And by the time I came back, though, from visiting 30 customers, realized these were businesses, so I was talking to several people at each customer. I knew as much as anybody in the organization about the customers, and I could drop names with the best of them. And the sales force loved me because they knew I knew the customers. And I actually, it's not just that I learned about the customers, I built relationships that I used for years with customers, with salespeople, with marketing people. They knew, this person knew what they were talking about. So the first order of business is deep knowledge of your users and customers. Second order of business is deep knowledge of the data. And that typically means three kinds of data. It means the user analytics, whatever tool you use for that, what people are actually clicking on and not clicking on. It means sales analytics. What's your sales cycle? What's the win rate? What's going on there? What's the average price? Things like that. And then the third is data warehouse data, which is how data changes over time. That's that longer-term view. Every modern product manager starts their day with about a half an hour a day in these tools, looking at the very latest, because they're expected by their team to be on top of this, especially when we're running live data tests like with Optimizely every week. The product manager needs to be on top. They might have a data analyst to help them understand like weird things that are going on or figure out how to answer a question with the data, but they don't delegate to that analyst. This is on the product manager. And similarly, they might have help on the first one with users and customers by user researchers, but again, they're there to enable and to educate you, not to be the expert. It's got to be the product manager there. The third one is deep knowledge of the industry and the domain. So you have to know what the product's about. With some things, like a calendar service, it's pretty simple. In other things, it's hard. Like you're doing software for a medical practice or something like that. You have to learn a lot about that business. But it seems obvious to me, I hope it is to you, that product manager doesn't understand that is going to be lost at sea. You also have to understand the industry you're in, the competitive landscape, which trends are relevant and that you really need to pay attention to. So that's the third big area. And the fourth big area, what did I say? I said users. Does anybody answer that? Anybody know that? I'm blanking on it. Of course, the hardest one, actually. Deep knowledge of your own company. It's the one I talked about when I talked about the CEO of the product. You need to know how your product works. You need to know all the dimensions of your business. Like I said, sales, marketing, services, security, privacy, finance. So those are the four big things that a product manager needs to know to become competent. Now, for most people, that's 2 or 3 months of dedicated time. That's the onboarding for a new product manager. So first of all, I would call that non-trivial, 2 or 3 months. And that's of serious work, several hours a day with the manager, hopefully coaching you along and guiding you to the right places. But I also think it's not unreasonable. Most people can do that if they put the effort in. Now, there's also, you need to learn about techniques, but I don't think that's that hard. Like techniques for modern discovery, you can learn that. And there's also the element of working with people, working with your teammates, understanding design and engineering, and collaborating and working with stakeholders, but those also can be coached. Where most of the time goes in, honestly, is those 4 knowledge skills, knowledge traits. So that's what we mean by competence. And until you're competent, your manager needs to be helping you every day to get there. And frankly, they're responsible for your work until you're there. So that's what so many companies are doing is not that. You know what they do? This is my pet peeve. They send the person to a CSPO class, Certified Scrum Product Owner. They get their dumbass little certificate, and they think they're a product manager. Oh my gosh, that's none of what I talked about. That literally, it's like 5% of your work as a product manager is to do the rituals involved with the development process your engineers are using, which is, for most of you, is Scrum or Kanban or some variant. So that's not what it's about. Should you go to a CSPO class? I encourage it if you've never done it. It's super easy. But it is not the job of a product manager. But that is where so many people go south. I mean, this is a pet topic of mine because I actually feel like despite our industry growing so much, the average skill level of a product manager has actually dropped. And I attribute that to so many people thinking product management equals the product owner role. Product manager job includes the product owner role, but it includes a lot more. Hopefully that makes sense. The hard part is not administering Jira. The hard part, right, is figuring out what to put in the backlog. Okay. Well, there's my 4 topics. I have been writing a series of articles recently on trying to help. This is really bothering me. I'm like, honestly, I dedicated this year to focus on helping managers of product managers to coach their people. And so I've been writing like a madman on these topics. I actually just published another article today, but earlier in the week I published one that spelled out, it's a long read, but it spells out, so I should have said that last month I published an article which is a tool that I used for years to help managers of product managers assess their product managers. Just normal. You hire a new product manager, everybody's different. The first thing you want to do is figure out what they're already good at and what they're not ready for. And so it does a simple gap analysis, and there's about 15 dimensions that are important for a competent product manager. And I'm like, just rate the person where they are right now. It's not that hard. And then you know where it needs to be for this level job, and figure out if there are gaps. And then if there are gaps, and that's what this newer article was, where there are gaps, for every one of the gaps, I shared the coaching tips that I use to help the product manager close those gaps. It's all learnable. This is what I mean by doing your homework. You can all do this. It does take time and effort, but it's not, again, it's not rocket surgery. Okay. All right. And so this is my big focus this year, is trying to get your managers to do their job, to really take the job seriously. There are several responsibilities for heads of product or directors or VPs, chief product officers, but by far the biggest, number one responsibility is to make sure they have a team of competent product managers. And I see not nearly enough of them spending their time on that. The best ones, they do that, but unfortunately most of them don't. And so then you have all these teams, especially the engineers, will complain about the incompetent product managers, and they get frustrated. A lot of them will leave, especially if they've come from a company that had competent product managers. Once they've had that, they don't want to let go. All right. So, let's talk about what I mean by, I'm just summing up really, when I talk about these truly empowered teams, because this is really what it's about. This is what I'm hoping, I think every product person should be working on an empowered team. That's how you do the job. I don't know how to do the job if you're not in an empowered team. I just believe it's a very different job. That's where, frankly, all you need is that product owner. But there are 3 things. The first one is that the team is actually staffed with competent people covering the range of skills. So that's normally product, design, and engineering. Of course, there can be many different kinds of engineers. There could even be multiple designers, but usually it's a product designer, product manager, and some number of engineers. It's usually between 2 and about 10, depending on circumstances and the type of software. And then the other point I'm trying to bring up there, and I haven't really brought this up, but empowered teams really do depend on collaboration. And I'm not saying that to be politically correct. I mean literally collaboration. And that requires a level of trust. And trust depends on making sure you don't have assholes on the team. Honestly, that's really the thing. And that doesn't, I'm not only talking about the product manager, but I will admit, disproportionately, they seem to be product managers. But it is that those people break trust. That's what's really going on. And so over the years, I've really come to appreciate just how critical that is. That's a whole other talk. But the point is, we want to make sure we have people that are of character, that are not like that toxic to the team. Lots of personalities, lots of room for personalities, but not that. All right, second, we don't want to just give that team a roadmap of features. We want to give that team a set of problems to solve. And those problems to solve, to be clear, when we say empowered team, it's not like go figure out what you want to work on. That's not what empowered team means. Empowered teams means the executives decide what is important for our company this quarter, and they give you that set of problems. But the difference is, instead of giving you 10 features to build, they're giving you 2 or 3 problems to solve. And then you figure out, that's what empowered means. You're empowered to figure out the best way to solve that problem. That's what we're looking for. It's just a little give and take. It's not that big of a difference, but that's what we're looking for. It is, John Doerr, the venture capitalist, likes to say, we need teams of missionaries, not teams of mercenaries. And he's trying to say that point. Same thing, is that you don't want them to just be order takers, your team. You want the team to take ownership of the problem and figure out a solution. The nice part about empowerment is it brings along accountability, which is the last point. The team is actually accountable for solving the customer and or business problem. And we talk about outcome, results, not output. Roadmaps are output. You may do a roadmap or not, but the point is your value is to create results, to actually solve problems. So that's what we're looking for. That's a simple litmus test. You can figure out if you have it or not. If you're not working in this way, I would say, unfortunately, you're working in the IT model. In fact, a simple way of describing it is in the IT model, product teams exist to serve the business, which is literally how it's framed. But in a product company, product teams exist to serve the customers in ways that work for the business, which is it's actually a massive difference. All right. Okay. Well, I think I was about on an hour there.